And so here we go. And hi, everyone. I'm saying hi because I presume that we are on. In fact, we are. We're live. We're live. You know, you do this enough times, you get the hang of it. Hey, look, you notice I left a little crack in the door. As Leonard Cohen says, that's how the light gets in. I guess that's the song, right? Uh Hallelujah, it's a Sunday. Welcome to Sunday brunch at the museum with Emil, or Sunday brunch with Emil at the museum. But I'm not at the museum because, as you know, we can't be at the museum. They won't let us. It's a law. Well, it's highly prescribed. I guess they won't bust us if we show up. But then what good would it be? Because if you showed up at the museum and one of us got sick and died, then we'd feel really bad. We weren't supposed to die yet. Well, I know, but anyway, we can't be at the Filipino-American National Historical Society Museum on Weber Avenue today, as is our wont on Saturdays and Sundays on the weekends, because there are no ICU beds in no ICU beds in the San Joaquin Valley area. I mean, do you get that? The no ICU beds in the appointed San Joaquin Valley region in the California pandemic map, which goes from the actual San Joaquin County, Stockton, all the way down to Bakersfield, Fresno, all that. No ICU beds. This is historical. I keep saying that you should be taking pictures and maybe doing a diary about what's going on in your lives, because I assure you, a year from now, when hopefully, cross our fingers, things are over, or maybe 5 years, would it be that long? We'll all be wondering what happened. How did you fare during the coronavirus pandemic? And it will be your notes that will say, I don't know what I'm thinking now, but look, here's what I wrote back then. Here's what I was thinking. You know, take out your little cameras, your little phones, right? Take a picture. Take a picture of, what you were doing instead of going to church. A lot of people can't go to church. A lot of people are upset about that. But frankly, I mean, there are some exceptions in certain places in the country, but I don't know. Would you risk it? Some are. I was talking with a friend today who lives in the part of the country, and he's actually pretty conservative. And he joked around saying, "Oh, hey, I'm masked up, by the way. It's about time. It's about time." So document these things. Get out your cameras. Get out your notebooks. Write down your thoughts. Oh my God, it's been 2 weeks since I saw my mom, and she just lives like a couple blocks away, or whatever. For me, it's been 18 years because that's when my mom passed away. But think about that. These are stories that we will tell each other, and how we acted, how we either embraced our role and did what we could to stop the pandemic or not, will determine how long this period goes. We may be saying, God, that was a long 5 years. Could be. Don't know. Good. Oh, that was a long 20, 24 months. Or maybe it's a long soon after the vaccines were distributed and everyone was fine. And it's because of the good sense and the common good that people had and the respect for public health that we were able to go back to normal. That's what we hope. Now, today I'm going to talk more about Pearl Harbor Day and how the Filipino Americans reacted. I'm going to do a This Week in Filipino American History and read from Dawn Mabalon's book. But I do want to first mention our interview yesterday with Lizelle Tanglao, who I always thought was from Stockton, but she's actually from Carson down in LA, Filipino American, born here, was in journalism. And I thought I was happy that she indulged me some of the part of the conversation where we talked about the media, because between her and we've been in the media since the mid 70s. She comes in, and what state is the media? The media has changed. We are now doing everything online, digitally. We are now virtualizing everything. After digitalizing everything, the world has changed. And uh it's just it just keeps moving. And how diverse is it? How represented are Filipino American views and thoughts and ideas and stories? And as Lizelle said, when it comes to the virus, not much. We need to see more. And so, as part of the historical response of what Filipino Americans are doing, we see that Lizelle, after visiting the Philippines, after getting a sense of her Filipino-ness, got together with other people in this group, this young leaders group, to form what they call Tayo, which means us in Tagalog, Tayo Help, Tayo help.com, where you can go to get information about the virus and maybe counteract a lot of things that may be not true. Now they've got a fledgling grant. They're trying to put it together. And, welcome to our world here in the nonprofit museum world, the small micro Oregon nonprofit museum world. But I hope they succeed, because there's a lot of information that needs to get out to people. And the Filipino American community has been ignored. So, we were talking about vaccines, and certainly they're going to serve the frontline workers first, but then it's going to be tiered off by age once vaccines are distributed. But that's going to be a nightmare. Now, if you have lived through vaccine distribution, and those of us of a certain age have, I just remember they passed out those little sugar cubes in school, right, for polio. I remember taking it, not thinking a thing about it. And I know that some of you have reservations. In fact, it's kind of anecdotal now how we all feel about, the vaccine. Would we take it? I think I would, just based on the fact that I believe in science, and so far the science suggests that the vaccine is safe. But we don't know. A lot of it is we don't know. Now, you say, well, you take the vaccine for the virus, but you're not going to take the flu vaccine, Emil. What's wrong with you? Well, the flu vaccine, it's always based on yesterday's flu. We don't know what flu is going to be out there this year. People tend to get a little sick reacting to a vaccine for flu. So I just figured I'm going to take the risk, since I'm staying home. I'm locking down, masking up. I'm going to take the risk by not taking that vaccine, but I'll wait and I'll take the coronavirus vaccine. I'll take that one. My choice. I don't know if that's necessarily sound. A lot of people are saying, hey, take double vaccine, right? Take the flu and the COVID vaccine, because this is going to be a long, tough winter. And as I speak, and here in the San Joaquin Valley, it's raining, it's cold, I got my mask on here, just in case I need it. I know we have this prophylactic device here, but just in case I need it, I got a mask here. Anyway, listen to yesterday's interview. It's on the FANHS, FANHS Museum, FANHS Museum Facebook page. You can see me. I'm wearing a red thing. I'm trying to vary the colors so that you can say, oh, that he was red that day. Oh, today he's green. Benny Agbayani's jersey's on that side. Whatever. So Lizelle, the interview I think was a good one. She tries to say what they're trying to do. You have to see what kind of information they had. She couldn't exactly say a lot now because they're just ramping up and a lot of the information is not known. But they're out there thinking of the Filipino-American community, and that's an historical response during this pandemic that is worthy of noting at the Filipino-American National Historical Society Museum. So here we are, the Sunday brunch. Hope you brought some good topsalog or whatever, your fresh lumpia, cup of coffee, whatever. We're going to be here a little bit. Usually we do a thing called This Week in Filipino-American History. And this week in Filipino-American history is kind of interesting because December 7th, of course, Pearl Harbor, and that kind of determines everything, you know, during this week in Filipino-American history. And they only just mention a couple of things, a couple other things we're thinking about. December 9th, 60 Filipinos were enrolled in the fall semester at UC Berkeley in 60. At UC Berkeley, Filipinos, 2010, 2020, 1970, 1932, 60 Filipinos enrolled at UC Berkeley. I would imagine they were probably the Ilustrados, right? Who came here. If you came in 1932 and were enrolled at Berkeley, you probably were wealthier than not, one of the pensionados who came, or that class seeking education, a wealthier class, and a slightly more elite class. It'd be interesting to see if those people went back to the Philippines or if they stayed on, lived their lives here in America, because that would be, they would be probably, well, they're similar to my story. My father came in 1928, but he was not in the pensionado class. My father was in the refrigerator class. My father was a cook. My father did not want to even go into the fields. He wanted to cook the vegetables. He wanted to work in the restaurants. So everyone found a way to America in the 20s and in the 30s. And on this day, December 9th, 60 at UC Berkeley, 1932, which, as I said, interesting to see. Did they find true love? Did they find discrimination? Because shortly after they were there in 32, in 1934, Tidings-McDuffie Act said, hey, you aliens, or you Filipino nationals, no longer nationals, you are now aliens. Did they go back? Dan Gonzalez, professor at San Francisco State, said a lot of people did go back. If you could afford it, if you were successful, because, hey, you could say, I went there. The law says I can come back. I'm Filipino again. But if you came like my father in 1928 and you came here seeking your fortune, your opportunity, and were suddenly told you're no longer an American national, but you're an alien, do you go back in shame? Back to the farm? It's a different situation. It depends on the class that you were in. Pensionados went back. Most rank and file Filipinos who came here spent their last few dollars on that dollar steamship. They stuck it out. Like my father. But it meant living that bachelor life, living that ag life, living that migrant life, going up and down the coast, maybe, you know, from California up to Alaska, or maybe going out throughout the nation to find out, well, it's got to be better somewhere else. Something to think about just from that little line there. 60 Filipinos at UC Berkeley in 1932. One other idea, and then, well, let's just get to the whole Pearl Harbor thing, because that's the biggest thing. December 7th, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. By December 9th, Japanese army invades northern Luzon, 1941. So we know that within 10 hours, the attacks started in the Philippines. They were in northern Luzon on December 9th. December 13th, here in California. In response to the beginning of World War II, the Filipino community of Stockton calls a boycott against all Japanese businesses in Stockton. They also approved the I Am Filipino identification buttons that they wore, and they pledged loyalty to the United States, 1941. That was the response. The boycott. The boycott actually happened all up and down the coast, not just in Stockton, because on December 10th, 1941, the Philippine communities of the Pacific Coast calls an all Japanese boycott in response to the Pearl Harbor bombing and the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, 1941. So the 7th, Pearl Harbor, the 9th, the invasion into northern Luzon, although we know the attack was on like 10 hours after Pearl Harbor. And then December 10th, Philippine communities all up and down the West Coast declare this boycott of the Japanese, 1941. And then in Stockton, December 13th, this was a full-fledged community response in Stockton to the boycott. They had the I Am Filipino badges, and they pledged loyalty to the United States, which is a significant thing because you recall that 1941, before 1941, it's like the demarcation line. Before 1941, we had 1934 Tyrone McDuffie who had said, you are no longer national, you're alien. Some people went back and some people stayed. The successful one said, okay, I'm leaving. I'm going back. The poor, the people of the farms, the people who came here seeking their fortune, but were denied citizenship, denied marriage, denied ability to own land. Many of them said, I can't go back home in disgrace. They stuck it out. So this was the situation in Stein. A lot of this, all of this, mostly sourced. We used Dawn Mabalon's Little Manila is in the Heart, her book. And I think it's worth noting, that this is one of the things that we discover in history. We read history because we learn what we don't know. We learn the truth of what happened, and we embrace the truth. We don't deny it. We don't say, hey, a lot of Filipinos married Japanese too, They were Filipino-Japanese family. I know. I talked to the historian Alex Fabros, who told me about Japanese-American, Filipino-American families who together left California looking for a better place because they wanted to escape the internment. And what they found the door shut in their faces. And they found the J word used frequently because it was used frequently by everyone, right? The J word being the word that rhymes with nap, which is a different kind of N word that, now everyone says the N word. Oh, back then, the N word was used frequently, and the J word used frequently to talk about hate, to talk about the xenophobia. And it was a kind of self-xenophobia that Filipino-Americans, Japanese-Americans, or the Chinese-Americans rather, had toward the Japanese-Americans. Now, I know it's like I said, when you discover these things, you say, oh, I can't believe that. They did that. Yeah. So let's ignore it and not say anything. No, let's not embrace it, but let's acknowledge it, and let's be ashamed for the past, and let's go forward in the future with the proper response to xenophobia, with the proper response to all that. Easy for us to say in the 21st century, oh yeah, Yeah, that's bad. Xenophobia bad. Back then, 1941, what would you do? Would you be like the others who said, "Yeah, let's boycott the Japanese businesses because they were they were on top of the world, right? They were the favored group. Now, if the Japanese out of the way, people see the Filipinos and the Chinese not as demons, not as half human, but as allies." Everything changed for Filipino Americans and even Chinese Americans. They say, well, what does this mean, Emil, for like diversity? I mean, because like now that we know this truth, we should be ashamed, right? Yeah, we should be ashamed. But it also tells us what life was like back then. It was really a Darwinian, every ethnic group for itself sort of thing. There was no solidarity, no Asian American solidarity. There was no Asian America. Really, there were just individual ethnic communities, some in closer proximity to others, where there could be a kind of a natural kind of solidarity, like when the Filipinos married some Japanese here in America. But for the most part, it was community pecking order, climbing the ladder. And when the Japanese were on top and then they were removed, the Japanese Americans were removed, then the Filipino Americans and the Chinese Americans saw opportunity to climb back up the ladder. That was the reality. And the boycott that happened in Stockton, as outlined in Dawn's book, showed that there was real opportunity because of the war. Not just because of the racial thing, but because Stockton was seen as an important port for the war effort. It was booming. That's part of our history, part of the history of the Delta region, part of the history of Filipinos. So how do we embrace it today? We say, look, we acknowledge it. We acknowledge the shame from this perspective, but we understand from the perspective of 1941 why our forebears did what they did. I mean, this is the thing about history. We're not trying to rewrite history, but we're trying to learn from it. That's for sure. I mean, so many things have come out just within the last couple of days about history and revelations, like Johns Hopkins, who they named the hospital in Baltimore. He was seen as a, great guy. Before now, they've uncovered some documents that show that Johns Hopkins owned 4 slaves. Do we honor that guy? This is part of the ongoing debate now. Do we honor people who turn out to be not so great or not so good as they once appeared? Now, we don't have that situation here with the Filipino American story and Pearl Harbor, but we do have a situation where, man, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about this realization? Just acknowledge it, right? We acknowledge it, we move forward, and we try to learn from it. Now, I'm going to share from Dawn Mabalon's book because some of you don't have it, and it's interesting to listen to an actual historian, right? Read from the actual historian's book. Oh, let's see. Here's my. Now you can see my screen. Okay, this is from Dawn Mabalon's book, and it's practically, you read it like it's practically a Bible, right? Especially here in Stockton. Little Manila is in the heart. Dawn Mabalon, tenured, the late Dawn Mabalon, tenured professor, San Francisco State. And okay, so I got my screen going, right? But I don't see my picture. Okay. Anyway, I'm sharing. So during the war, this is Filipinas O's Stockton in the war. Filipinas O's. I guess Dawn predates the Filipinx or the Latin X idea of how to become more woke in your language. But this was a functional decision. Filipinas O's, right? When you're dealing with language that is genderized. All right, let me read. During the war, Stockton, with its numerous military bases, became one of the most important cities on the West Coast, particularly in terms of shipbuilding and munitions work. The city landscape and economy were transformed by the war and the influx of millions of dollars of military infrastructure. Military infrastructure and defense contracts. As I was saying that earlier. The War Department mandated that manufacture of military material be at least 60 miles from the coast to avoid enemy attacks. As the largest inland port of the West Coast and close to 3 military installations, Stockton was strategically located for the defense industry, particularly shipbuilding. In 1944, Rough and Ready Island in South Stockton was transformed into a $20 million naval supply depot, which supplied the Pacific Fleet. The Army depot in Sleepy French Camp, just south of Stockton, became the supply base of the Pacific. The historian Olive Davis argues that because of the concentration in shipbuilding and materiel, as well as its strategic position as a port and supply center, Stockton was considered the #1 military target in California. Imagine that. Stockton, the #1 military target in California. After the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor and invasion of the Philippines, thousands of Filipinos rushed to their local recruiting offices, only to be turned away because they were aliens ineligible for citizenship. Writing that it was discussing that laws had been passed to bar them from more active participation in the war program, journalists at the Commonwealth Times demanded that a nationwide program for Filipino war relief be instituted and that Filipinos be allowed to enter the armed forces. And as Don points out, this was a turning point for the Filipino and Japanese communities in Stockton. It came in February 1942. On February 19th, Filipinos in Stockton were finally given a chance to play a formal role in the war. And the problem of the Japanese on the coast was brought to a tragic resolution. Sensing a public relations opportunity that would lift morale in both the Philippines and the United States, it's always about PR, isn't it? It's always about PR. President Franklin Roosevelt announced he was changing the draft law to allow Filipinos to join the military and work in the defense industry. An amendment to the Nationality Act of 1940 allowed Filipinos who enlisted in the military to become naturalized citizens. So you wonder how your dad became a citizen. You joined the war effort. You became, from here, from the United States, you became naturalized. In California, approximately 16,000 Filipinos attempted to enlist in the U.S. Army, about 2/5 of the state's Filipino population. Of course, those were the lucky ones because, like as I've said, my dad was somewhat heavy, had some health conditions, was 4F. And it was the 4F of life, not just the military, because he was cut out of all the things that lifted up the Filipino community. It was the war that lifted up the Filipino community. Almost like the affirmative action for the Filipino Americans in those days, the war effort. In keeping with the Army's segregation policy, you knew that was coming, huh? Most of the 7,000 Filipinos who eventually enlisted were organized into 2 all-Filipino regiments in the spring of 1942. the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiments. Filipinos in Stockton also formed their own local unit of the National Guard. Representatives of these groups marched proudly in the 4th of July parade with other Filipino contingents during the war. Now, I'm sure you know about the 442, right? If you're in the Central Valley, you know there are roads honoring the 442. That was a Japanese American contingent. They're allowed to fight. And they were tough, right? They have movies that go for Brooks, right? Well, the little known Filipino version of that, the 1st and 2nd Infantry, known in the Filipino community, not necessarily widely known elsewhere, but just like a lot of our history, not widely known, like the Filipino-American reaction to Pearl Harbor. In language much different from the rhetoric used by lawmakers to rebuff moves toward Filipino naturalization, only a few months earlier, Secretary of War Henry Stimson stated that the Filipino regiments were formed because of the intense loyalty and patriotism of Filipinos in the United States. The act of formally joining the U.S. military and after decades of struggle, being granted the right to become an American citizen, imbued enlisted Filipinos with a sense of pride and dignity, as well as intense feelings of patriotism and nationalism. It's always about the war, right? This is the way we showed it wasn't necessarily our jingoism, but our nationalism, our patriotism, but yeah, our jingoism too. We were warriors and had the promise of American citizenship after being ignored for so long. Well, from 34, when our colonial status was taken away, to now from being alien, if we fought, if we put our bodies, our lives on the line, we could be American. Isn't that wonderful? We could be American. The same, now here's the catch. The very same day that he announced changes in the draft law, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. Oh, 9066. You know 9066, right? Everyone who's Asian American should know 9066 because it will realign your moral compass. It directed the incarceration of ethnic Japanese in concentration camps. 9066. By May of 1942, the Japanese of Stockton had been imprisoned at the hastily built Assembly Center at the San Joaquin County Fairgrounds and were awaiting transfer to the Rower Camp in Arkansas. Same camp, if I'm not mistaken, that George Takei found his family, the Rower Camp in Arkansas. The handful of Stockton's mixed heritage Filipino-Japanese families, such as the Espineta family, were also incarcerated. Camila Carrito remembered that several Filipinas broke into the hall in which the Japanese had stored their belongings and stole all. The American people didn't care, she said. Though newspaper reports do not corroborate Carrito's memory of the incident, several community members, including Claro Candelario, repeated similar stories. Whether or not they are true is beside the point, argues the author here, Dawn Mabalon. These stories demonstrate that some Filipinos felt great pleasure and triumph in hurting the Japanese at their most vulnerable to avenge the treatment Filipinos had endured at the hands of Japanese farmers and merchants throughout the 20s and the Depression, and to retaliate for the Japanese invasion and occupation of the Philippines. Arguing that food production was essential for the war effort in January 1942, Bautista called for changes in the state's alien land law to allow Filipinos to lease farmland. Initially, there was no response to the proposal, but after the local Japanese were removed, The alien land law was amended to allow non-citizen Filipinos, Mexicans, and Chinese to lease land. And we know this was important. I know several Filipino Americans. Well, they weren't Americans then. They were Filipinos who tended the land south of Stockton, French Camp. Maybe this is why. Along the railroad, they weren't allowed to buy the land, but only lease the land. It wasn't just the greed of the companies, the laws prevented them from owning the land. But this is one of the things. And then to get back to this idea that the Filipinos were mixed because they saw this idea of attacking the Japanese or being naysayers about Japanese Americans here. It was a vengeance for the treatment that they had endured at the hands of Japanese farmers, at the hands of Japanese merchants from the 20s on. And this was 1941, right? World War II happens, 41. He says, our time has come. So from a 21st century standpoint, as we look back to how they may have acted or should have acted, and while it's shameful what happened, that they were for the incarceration, for the internment, that's what it boils down to. We have to also understand that there were some deep, passionate feelings. And once again, what we learned from all this is not that they were wrong or right, but that we learned from this history. So we know when there's another wave of xenophobia, we know the right way to act, perhaps. Or maybe we learn our own history or create our own history in the present. And let's hope it's a good one. Filipino businessmen also saw opportunity in the tragedy of Japanese removal. Alex Fabros, the father of the historian Alex Fabros. Alex Fabros, the editor of the Salinas-based Philippines Mail, encouraged Filipinos to jump at the opportunity provided by internment. This is the best time for enterprising people to open new businesses now that the Japs, there was that language used by everyone at the time. The J word was common at the time. The Japs, who once controlled 90 to 95% of Pinoy's patronage, have closed their joints, he wrote in January of 1942. Heeding Fabros's advice and also on their own accord, Filipino merchants and entrepreneurs flourished as the city, Stockton's, wartime economy boomed and the city's Japanese American entrepreneurs were forced out. Japanese hotels, restaurants, employment agencies, and other businesses were transformed almost overnight into Filipino ones. In many cases, these Filipino entrepreneurs changed the Japanese names of businesses to patriotic Filipino names or ones that reflected World War II heroism. For example, in an ironic twist, the office on the ground floor of the Japanese hotel at 241 South El Dorado Street, which had been the office of Dr. Bautista until Morimoto evicted him in 1940, became in 1941 Fernando Buslon's Filipino Employment Agency. Filipinos took over the hotel management, renamed it the Bataan Hotel sometime during the war. In 1946, the former Fukuoka Hotel at 228 South El Dorado was taken over by the Cirillo Juanitas, who renamed it the Quezon Hotel after Manuel Quezon, the president of the Philippine Commonwealth, and so forth and so on. The Bataan Pool Hall, the Manila Cigar Stand, the Manila Club, all of these buildings. Then you can see the map in Dawn's book about how the transformation happened. The Japanese Americans were out. The Filipino Americans fill the vacuum. Capitalist America and Filipino Americans were able to participate for once, but under these kind of circumstances. During the war, public attitudes shifted racial discourse decisively in favor of Filipinos because China and the Philippines were important allies. And the Japanese became the new racial scapegoats, emphasize racial scapegoats. The 3-month-long Battle of Bataan and the bravery of soldiers on the Bataan Death March and at Corregidor was reported in Stockton as front page news, which noted American Filipino bravery. Funny how she used the term American Filipino because it was a joint Filipino fighting with Americans. I've often used the term American Filipino to denote Filipinos born in America because I argue we are American Filipino. Once again, language counts for something. So Dawn talks about American Filipino bravery and heroism. This reportage moved and impressed whites. The Stockton Daily Evening Records pages, that's the evening newspaper. Evening newspapers were a thing back then. Now evening newspapers are dead. I don't know if there's one afternoon newspaper anymore. The San Francisco Examiner gave it a shot as an afternoon newspaper, and it's been long gone. But the Daily Evening Record filled with stories of heroism in the Philippines and images of the exploits of Filipino and American soldiers during the valiant struggle for the Philippines. The newspaper described Filipino soldiers as heroic, stoic, and valiant, and published photos of the 1st Filipino Infantry in training at Camp St. Luis Obispo. Let me do this. I stop here. I just want to make sure I know where we're going here. Hold on, folks. So glad you're here. But I think I'm just okay, I'm just going to continue reading. Oh, what happened? When Jose Calugas, a 116-pound mess sergeant, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for bravery during the fighting in Bataan, the Stockton Daily Evening Record gushed with praise. The Filipinos won respect as hard fighters in Funston's time at the hinge of the century. Another generation of Filipinos, now that's questionable. Because remember, the Filipinos who won respect as hard fighters in Funston's time revolted against Funston and the Americans and lost. But they revolted. Another generation of Filipinos, this time as comrades in arms, are proving their mettle. Only a few years before, the same editors denigrated Filipinos as unassimilable, sexual deviants, and miscreants. Now, that's an important point because it's true. People calling Filipinos lusty rabbits, watch out, lock up your women. They'll steal your women, these Filipinos. They'll steal your jobs. They can't assimilate. They're sexual deviants. They're ne'er-do-wells. We know that. During the war, Stockton's elite began to welcome Filipinos into their homes as guests and not only as domestics. A true step up. Not only could we clean their house, but we can dirty them now. My words, not Dawn's. The Filipino-American Literary Club, a social organization formed in 1941 by Protestant missionaries connected with the Lighthouse Mission and second-generation protest Filipinas, met monthly. To do what, Emil? To discuss the Bible and to pray together at Filipino and white homes. The war brought Filipinos and whites together. At the 1942 annual dinner hosted in the home of an elite white family in North Stockton, the white women were pleasantly surprised to learn that Filipinas were civilized. Oh my God, you guys are civil. Do you wear underwear and just like just like us white people? These women are just like we are, exclaimed one attendee. Oh, you mean we didn't learn that lesson in 1904 when we brought all those savages to the World's Fair in St. Louis and we said, hey, you're just like us. We're going to colonize you. But now, because of World War II, white people said, hey, Filipinos, you're just like we are. Stockton's elite white women of the North Stockton Philomathian Club, a philanthropic and social club, warmly welcomed Pilar Hidalgo Lim, a mathematics professor at the University of Philippines and the wife of Vicente Lim, Brigadier General of the Philippine Scouts and the first Philippine graduate of West Point, for a talk about the heroics of Filipino soldiers at Corregidor and post-war Philippine independence in January of 1944. Even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt spoke about the brotherhood forged in the Philippines and the racial understanding that had been born from the war. The courageous fighting in the Philippines, she said, has been an excellent example of what happens when two different races respect each other. Men of different races and backgrounds have fought side by side and praised each other's heroism and courage. Filipinos revealed in their new status as good Asians now that the Asians previously favored by white elites were imprisoned in concentration camps. The Filipino writer Manuel Buaken wrote in his memoirs, quote, no longer do I feel myself in the presence of my enemies. We Filipinos are the same. It is Americans that have changed in their recognition of us. Much like the black soldiers inspired by the black community's double victory campaign, the Pittsburgh Courier's wartime slogan of victory over fascism abroad and racism at home. And don't you know, that's where we have these parallel experiences. We experienced it, the African Americans experienced it. Many Filipinos saw their service in the war as a struggle for freedom from the Japanese occupation in the Philippines and the anti-Filipino racism at home. Oh, emancipating war, wrote Fernando Tagoa, a Stanford student in 1942. Gone will be the thousands of Filipinos, particularly in California, relieved of the brunt of prejudice and injustice. No more shall the illiterate workers be oppressed, exploited, and made to live in shacks and hotels, or hovels rather, for they will have gone to fight and die for their freedom. There's the sound of idealism, huh? With the public opinion now on their side, Filipinos took every opportunity to join whites in demonizing Americans. Oh, Japanese Americans. In the heady nationalism of war, some Filipinos easily forgot that through the Depression, they had little reason to celebrate American ideals of liberty and civil equality. Smug Filipinos were now insisting that while the Japanese community had selfishly taken advantage of American opportunities and remained foreign, Filipinos had loyally assimilated and upheld American values. Many Filipinos supported internment for various reasons. Some, sympathetic to the Japanese, felt that it protected them from racial violence, meaning the Japanese, while others, bitter over Depression era relations between Japanese and Filipinos, derived personal satisfaction from seeing the Japanese lose their land and experience extreme racial repression. Even Filipinos who blasted American imperialism and racism before Pearl Harbor now behaved as though they were still loyal colonial subjects who worshiped at the knee of Mother America, and they accused the Japanese of being sinister, anti-American fifth columnists. Boakin implied that Filipinos were better Americans than Japanese. We have always wanted nothing more than to learn from America, to become good Americans. He went on to criticize Japanese American entrepreneurs who formed their own banks, ethnic stores, and Japanese schools. We have striven to learn English, not to perpetuate foreign language schools and to teach foreign ideas to our children. And you know, that kind of idea meant that that's a reason why a lot of American kids born in, from Filipino mothers and fathers did not learn Tagalog like maybe they should have, because we're learning American with an English, with a bad Filipino accent. That's why I talk like this. That's why I talk like this. Nationalist Filipino leaders arrogantly compared themselves favorably to what they called the disloyal, alien, and unpatriotic Japanese. Vicente Villamin, an attorney, exhorted Japanese Americans interned in camps to intensify their feelings of gratitude for the United States for the opportunity in pre-wartime to have lived, worked, and prospered under its flag. Additionally, he wrote that internees should overlook the legal and legalistic considerations surrounding American citizenship and its treatment while the emergency of the war lasted. In this atmosphere of positive Filipino sentiment, Bulasan, the Stockton Filipino-American community's most famous writer, published an essay to accompany Norman Rockwell's painting Freedom from Want, referring to President Roosevelt's stirring wartime speech on the four freedoms. The other three were freedom of fear, freedom of speech, and freedom of worship. So freedom of want, freedom from fear, freedom of speech, and freedom from worship. And this was in the Saturday Evening Post. And in doing so, he was discovered by the rest of the country, as August Espiritu writes. Bulasan's essay was an eloquent and impassioned popular front plea for the American working class. Quote, so long as the fruit of our labor is denied us, so long will want manifest itself in a world of slaves, he wrote. It is only when we have plenty to eat, plenty of everything, that we begin to understand that what freedom means. The essay also reflected some of the deep yearnings of Filipinos to live in the America they had idealized, and Bulasan's changing ideas about how that nation lived in the dreams of its denizens. Quote, the America we hope to see is not merely a physical, but also a spiritual and intellectual world, he wrote. We are the mirror of what America is. If America wants us to be living and free, then we must be living and free. We want to share the promises and fruits of American life. We want to be free from fear and hunger. In retrospect, it was a daring essay that could not have been penned before the war, when attitudes toward Filipinas and Filipinos were more negative. Isn't that interesting? This is why Pearl Harbor was really that demarcation point. We were seen as half human before, whole human afterwards, and still, even though the changes, we know the discrimination during the war and after, and what we've lived through since. We know it was only relative, the change. In April 1945, Johnny Dionisio addressed the California State Assembly, reminding its members of the heroism of Filipino soldiers in Bataan and appealing for legislation sympathetic to the more than 30,000 Filipino residents of the state. By then, Dionisio was an official in the San Francisco office of the resident commissioner. They are the brothers, the cousin, the kinsfolk of the 21,000 Filipino soldiers who died for you, the American flag, in the foxholes of Bataan, he said. They are law-abiding, industrious, respectful of the rights of others. I appeal to you, please remember them when you make your laws. Filipino-American friendship has been sealed in blood and flowed together in the dust. Oh, such florid language, typical of Filipinos, right? Filipino-American bodies were mangled by the same Japanese bombs, riddled by the same Japanese bullets. Please remember that we share the same hopes, dream the same dreams, fight the same fight for a better world to live in. Dionisio could deliver this speech in 1945 because attitudes toward Filipinos across the nation were the most positive they had ever been. Imagine that. My father came in 1928, and what did he face? He faced the hate, the Filipinophobia, 1930s, right? The Fermin Tabera is shot, killed in his bunk. And now 1945, they love us because we fought with them. We took blood, we took a bullet. With the war in the Philippines as the rallying point, the increasingly factionalized Filipino community, it's always factionalized. The community in Stockton strove vainly to continue to live up to its self-proclaimed status as a model Filipino community. The annual dances, fundraisers, dinners, potlucks, conferences, conventions went on, albeit on a less grand scale, with thousands of Filipino men missing. They were all at war, and with a nationalist consciousness and a heady awareness of the rising status of Filipinos in Stockton. Pinays in Stockton worked tirelessly for the war effort, organizing women's groups for war relief work, visiting Filipino soldiers, undergoing training in Salinas, and organizing war bond drives that raised thousands of dollars for the war effort. In November 1944, Bautista, president of the Stockton Filipino community, presented the Treasury Department with $97,000 in war bonds, approximately $1.24 million in 2012 dollars. This was an enormous amount considering most Filipino wage earners were in farm work. And so that is where we shall stop reading from Dawn's book, Little Manila's in the Heart, but an interesting overview of Pearl Harbor of the week, right? December 7th to December 13th, and what it meant going forward, right? December 7th, Pearl Harbor. 10 hours later, Japanese invade the Philippines. People get enraged here. Filipino Americans on the West Coast calls for boycotts of the Japanese American businesses. December 13th, a full-fledged boycott in Stockton. And then little by February, Filipinos are allowed to be drafted and serve. And the same day the draft law was changed, also Executive Order 9066 in the internment, which is really, it's the ethical moment in Asian America. As you look back and look at our history, what brings us together? What is that ethical moment? It's the internment. Where were the Filipinos, though, in that internment? A great many were for the internment of the Japanese Americans because it meant opportunity for Filipinos, as I just read from Dawn's book. What would a little solidarity have meant? What would have been different if I'm sure someone did stand up and say, hey, they're just like us too, right? We're fellow Asian Americans. Well, as I said, there was no Asian America back then. And as I mentioned in conversation with Professor Daniel Phil Gonzalez, when did you first hear the term? It had to be an historical term of scholars getting together saying, we're Asian American, we have this umbrella, and applying the umbrella to everything, politics primarily. But when was there the first sense of Asian America that you felt? Was it maybe the death of Vincent Chin a Chinese person in the Detroit area who was killed partially because people thought he was Japanese and the Japanese car industry was wreaking havoc to the American car industry? What was it? I just remember as a reporter in the 80s, early 80s, when that whole story broke, I remember the activists who did feel a sense of Asian America, but it wasn't really. I mean, I think the Asian American Journalists Association was formed a little bit before in the 1980s. I mean, like if Vincent Chin was 82, maybe AAJ started in 1980, 1981, which means a sense of Asian America, which is our umbrella group, because we need all the numbers, right? Just like the Warriors say, strength in numbers. There's 25 million plus Asian Americans if you count us all their different ethnicities. If you just count Filipino Americans, we're just 4 million. What gives us the power? Coalitions. Coalitions where we find our common ground as Asian Americans. But interesting how, looking back in this history, we see it wasn't an easy path to get to this understanding that we are Asian Americans. And even to this day, it's a very loosely constructed umbrella common ground because we have a painful past. I have Japanese American friends, and whenever the internment comes up, I've worked with Japanese American people. And whenever the internment comes, we're, of course, respectful, ethical, moral. The internment was wrong. And yet to really understand what happened in history, there's a kind of not just pain, but there's a kind of shame too. But these are the lessons from history. So we'll end it here. There's just so much. I mean, Pearl Harbor was 1 week, right? From the 7th to the 13th, December 13th. But we could be having this conversation all along because the war effort comes to a head in February, right? And in fact, the U.S. was always trying to stay away from the war. They were drawn in because of the Pacific. And we let the English go out there, and the English and the Russians were fighting in Europe. The Americans came in the Pacific theater, and the Philippines was central. Don't underestimate the Philippines' role, because MacArthur went away, abandoned the Philippines, said, I shall return. And when he returns to Leyte in October 16th, 17th, those wars, the battles of Leyte, turning point of the war in the Pacific, and ultimately the war overall. I never really found myself, even though I studied history in college, I never really got into the wars. I was more taken by the intellectual history, of the artists and the philosophers and the musicians, and primarily in Europe, right? European intellectual history. Well, when you start from Weber and Marx and go on to Hegel and go on to Weber and Marx and all those guys, you usually end up in intellectual history. But so much Asian American history involved in the war that if you don't understand the war, you don't understand how Asian America really develops, or how the Filipino American community really develops. And this is Filipino American history, but it's also U.S. history, American history. And, you know, it's just not being taught. It's not being told. So many things that history is the first draft of news, but history, when it's not learned, it stays that first draft. It stays news. It becomes news when you hear it and you say, oh, how could I not know that? Right? We uncover it all the time. We, when we remember these stories and tell these stories, we commit this act of history. And this act of history is really, this is what makes a museum what it is. I mean, it's a storytelling museum. It's a museum where we bring our stories together. And because of COVID and because we can't be together in our 1,500 square foot gallery on Weber Street, Weber Avenue in Stockton, we come together with these talks, these pop-ups, these virtual pop-ups. And we will till further notice. So I hope you got something out of today, out of today's pop-up. If you liked it, like it on the Facebook page, or, you know, just give us a like. That's the currency of Facebook. If you like us a lot, donate to the museum. It's an official 501c3. You get full write-off privileges. You get to feel good because you enable us to tell our stories. You become our hero, and we appreciate that. You can email me at Filipino. Let's see. I'll just send it to my email. Oh, you can send it to my email at Emil Amok, EMILAMOK at gmail.com. Emil Amok at gmail.com. And you can always check out my website at amok.com for more information and details about other things I'm doing, other places where I write, like the Inquirer.net, like the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. But I thank you for your time today. If you missed any or all of this, well, you know, you can always contact us by going to the, you can go to the FANHS Museum Facebook page and click on the video. Oh, he's wearing a green thing today. Yeah, I'm wearing a green thing. And check out the full video. And you can always check out the full book, Little Manila's in the Heart by Professor Dawn Mabalon. We sell it at the museum bookstore. If you want a copy, get a copy. Send me an email at Emil Amok, EMILAMOK at gmail.com. And we'll make sure you know how to buy a copy of the book. Once again, proceeds go to the museum. Everything goes to the museum. It's a labor of love. We're an all volunteer organization. That's how we make it work. That's how we make it work. So, but we make it fun too. So thanks for joining in the fun today. My name is Emil Guillermo. Thank you on behalf of the board of the FANHS Museum and all the good people behind it, you know, Terry and Chris and Mel, Jalissa, all the folks on the board who are out there making sure that the museum in your mind is an actual place, but because of COVID is something like this. Thank you for sharing your time. We'll be back. We do pop-ups every now and then. So check on my amok.com page or check right here, the Facebook page at FANHS, FANHS, Filipino-American National Historical Society Museum, the FANHS Museum page for the latest updates. Remember to mask up, right? Mask up. Take care. Be safe. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. We pop up when we pop up. So catch us. Just say, oh, is he there? They pop up today. Oh, okay, good. Oh, there they are. Because we will. Or and some guy said, the way I listen to you, I listen to you like I listen to radio. I'll put it on and I'll just have it on in the background of my speakers and I'll do my thing. And it's like listening to you when you were doing talk radio. Yeah, it's sort of like, except we don't have those. I'm trying to find a proper adjective I can use. Uh, we don't have those. What are they? The callers who want to like say you're wrong, or we don't have callers. We have interviews. I guess we could have callers. Put something in the chat. I'll respond to you later. I'm sorry I can't do it all at once, but put it in the chat. Do everything you can, because that's the currency of Facebook. And once again, don't forget a donation if you feel so moved to be a hero of the museum. Thanks again. I'm Emil Guillermo. As my dear friend Dawn, the late Professor Dawn Mabalon would have said, mahals and salamats.